Welcome back to your next chapter in the history of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time.
The mariner whose bark, pursued by furious winds, is suddenly lifted on the top of some billow mightier than its fellows, floated in safety over the reef on which it seemed about to be dashed, and safely landed in the harbor, is not more surprised or more thankful than Calvin was when he found himself in this quiet and serene and secure asylum. The exile needed rest. He needed time for reading and meditation. He found both under this princely and friendly roof. The library of the chateau was one of the finest of which France or perhaps any other country in that age could boast, containing, it is said, some 4,000 volumes. Here he reposed, but was not idle. As Luther had been wafted away in the midst of a tempest to rest a while at the Wartburg, so Calvin was made to sit down here and equip himself for the conflicts that were about to open. Around him were the mighty dead, and nothing to interrupt his converse with them. An occasional hour he would pass in communing with his friend, the young Louis du Tillet. But even this had to be redeemed. Nights without sleep, and whole days during which he scarcely tasted food, would Calvin pass in this library. So athirst was he for knowledge. It was here that Calvin projected his Institutes, which de Bigny styles the finest work of the Reformation. Not that he wrote it here, but in this library he collected the materials, arranged the plan, and maybe penned some of its passages. We shall have occasion to speak of this great work afterwards. Suffice it here to remark that it was composed on the model of those apologies which the early fathers presented to the Roman emperors on behalf of the primitive martyrs. Again, men were dying at the stake for the gospel. Calvin felt that it became him to raise his voice in their defense. But how could he better vindicate them than by vindicating their cause, and proving in the face of its enemies and of the whole world that it was the cause of truth? But to plead such a cause before such an audience was no light matter. He prepared himself by reading, by much meditation, and by earnest prayer, and then he spoke in the Institutes with a voice that sounded through Europe, and the mighty reverberations of which have come down the ages. An opponent of the Reformation chancing to enter, in later years, this famous library, and knowing who had once occupied it, cast around him a look of anger, and exclaimed, "This is the smithy where the modern Vulcan forged his bolts. Here it was that he wove the web of the Institutes, which we may call the Koran or Talmud of heresy." An episode of a touching kind varied the sojourn of Calvin at Angoulême. Lefebvre still survived, and was living at Nerac, near to Angoulême, enjoying the protection and friendship of Margaret. Calvin, who yearned to see the man who had first opened the door of France to the Reformation, set out to visit him. The aged doctor and the young reformer met for the first and last time. Calvin was charmed with the candor, the humility, the zeal, and the loving spirit of Lefebvre, lights that appeared to shine the brighter in proportion as he in whom they dwelt drew toward the tomb. Lefebvre, on his part, was equally struck with the depth and intellect and range of view exhibited by Calvin. a reformer of loftier stature than any he had hitherto known, stood before him. In truth, the future, as sketched by the bold hand of Calvin, filled him with something like alarm. Calvin's reform went a good way beyond any that Lefebvre had ever projected. The good doctor of Oedipus had never thought of discarding the Pope and hierarchy, but of transforming them into Protestant pastors. He was for uniting the tyranny of the infallibility with the liberty of the Bible. Calvin by this time had abandoned the idea of reforming Catholicism. His rule was the Word of God alone, and the hoped for end, a new structure on divine foundations. Nevertheless, the aged Lefebvre, grasping his hand, and perhaps recalling to mind his own words to Farel, that God would send a deliverer, and that they should see it, said, "Young man, you will be one day a powerful instrument in the Lord's hand. God will make use of you to restore the kingdom of heaven in France." Chapter 13. First Protestant administration of the Lord's Supper in France. Calvin goes to Poitiers. Its society. Calvin draws disciples around him. Reunions. The gardens of the Basses Trellis. The abbot Pontus. Calvin's grotto. First dispensation of the Lord's Supper in France. Formation of a Protestant congregation. Rome mission. Scheme for evangelization of France. The three first missionaries. Their labors and deaths. Calvin leaves Poitiers. The Church of Poitiers. Present state and aspect of Poitiers. Calvin had been a half year at Angoulême, and now the storm having blown over, he quitted it and returned northward to Poitiers. The latter was then a town of great importance. It was the seat of a flourishing university, and its citizens numbered amongst them men eminent for their rank, their learning, or their professional ability. 2 leagues distant from the town is the battlefield where, in 1356, the Black Prince met the armies of France under John of Valois, and won his famous victory. Here, in the spring of 1534, we behold a humble soldier arriving to begin a battle which should change the face of the world. In this district, too, in former times lived Abelard, and the traces he had left behind him, though essentially skeptical, helped to prepare the way for Calvin. Thin, pale, and singularly unobtrusive, yet the beauty of his genius and the extent of his knowledge soon drew around the stranger a charmed circle of friends. The prior of Troyes-Montiers, a friend of Du Tillet's, opened his door to the traveler. The new opinion had already found some entrance into the learned society of Poitiers, but with Calvin came a new and clearer light, which soon attracted a select circle of firm friends. The chief magistrate, Pierre de la Planche, became his friend, and at his house he was accustomed to meet the distinguished men of the place, and under his roof, and sometimes in the garden, the Basses Trellis, did Calvin expound to them the true nature of the gospel and the spiritual glory of the kingdom of heaven, thus drawing them away from the idle ceremonies and dead formulas to living doctrines by which the heart is renewed and the life fulfilled. Some contemned the words spoken to them, others received them with meekness and joy. Among these converts was Pontus, abbot of a Benedictine convent in the neighborhood of Poitiers and head of a patrician family. Forsaking a brilliant position, he was the first abbot in France who openly professed himself a disciple of the Reformed faith. Among his descendants, there have been some who gave their lives for the gospel, and to this day the family continues steadfastly on the side of Protestantism, adorning it by their piety not less than by their rank. It was at Poitiers that the evangelization of France began in a systematic way. The school which Calvin here gathered round him comprehended persons in all conditions of life, canons, lawyers, professors, counts, and tradesmen. They discoursed about divine mysteries as they walked together on the banks of the neighboring torrent, the Claine, or as they assembled in the garden of the Basis Trellis, where, like the ancient Platonists, they often held their reunions. There, as the papists have said, were the first beginnings in France of Protestant conventicles and councils, as it was in a garden, said the Roman Catholics of Poitiers, that our first parents were seduced. So are these men being enchanted by Calvin in the garden of the Basis Trellis. By and by it was thought prudent to discontinue these meetings in the Basis Trellis, and to seek some more remote and solitary place of reunion, a deep and narrow ravine, through which rolls the rivulet of the Claine, winds past Poitiers. Its rocks, being of the limestone formation, abound in caves, and one of the roomiest of these, then known as the Cave of Benedict, but which from that day to this has borne the name of Calvin's Grotto, was selected as the scene of the future gathering of the converts. It was an hour's walk from the town. Dividing into two groups, each company, by a different route, found its way to the cave. Here prayer was offered and the scriptures expounded, the torrent rolling beneath, and the beetling rocks and waving trees concealing the entrance. In this grotto, so far as the light of history serves, was the Lord's Supper celebrated for the first time in France after the Protestant fashion. On an appointed day the disciples met here, and Calvin, having expounded the word and offered prayer, handed round the bread and the cup, of which all partook, just as in the upper room at Jerusalem 16 centuries before. The place had none of the grandeurs of cathedral, but the glory of God and the Lamb lent it beauty. No chant of priest, no swell of organ accompanied the service, but the devotion of the contrite hearts, in fellowship with Christ, was ascending from that rocky chamber and coming up before the throne of heaven. Often since have the children of the Reformation assembled in dens and caves, in the forests, wildernesses, and mountains of France, to sing their psalm and celebrate their worship. And he who disdains the gorgeous temple, which unholy rites defile, has been present with them, turning the solitude of the low-browed cave into an august presence chamber, in which they have seen the glory and heard the voice of the Eternal. Calvin now saw, as the fruit of his labors, a little Protestant congregation in Poitiers. This did not content him. He desired to make this young church a basis of evangelization for the surrounding provinces, and ultimately for the whole kingdom. One day, in the little assembly, he said, "Is there anyone here willing to go and give light to those whom the Pope has blinded?" Jean Vernon, Philip Vernon, and Albert Babineau stood up and offered themselves for this work. Vernon and Babineau, turning their steps to the south and west, scattered the good seed in those fertile provinces and great cities which lie along the course of the Garonne. In Toulouse and Bordeaux they made many disciples. Obeying Calvin's instructions, they sought to win the teachers of the youth, and in many cases they entirely succeeded, so that, as we find the staunch Roman Catholic Ramon complaining, the minister was hid under the cloak of the magister. The young were lost before they were aware of their danger, and many, with only down on their chins, were so incurably perverted that they preferred being roasted over a slow fire to renouncing their Calvinism. Jean Vernon remained at Poitiers, where he found an interesting field of labor among the students at the university. It was ever the aim of Calvin to unite religion and science. He knew that when these are divorced, we have a race of fanatics on the one side and skeptics on the other. Therefore, of his little band, he commanded one day to abide at the university seat, and of the students not a few embraced the Reformed faith. These three missionaries, combining prudence with activity and escaping the vigilance of the priests, continued to evangelize in France to their dying day. Vernon and Babineau departed in peace. Vernon was seized as he was crossing the Alps of Savoy and burned at Chambry. This was the first home mission set a-going in modern times. After a stay of barely 2 months, Calvin quitted Poitiers, going on by way of Orleans and Paris to Noyon, his birthplace, which he visited now for the last time. But he did not leave Poitiers as he had found it. There was now within its walls a Reformed church, embracing many men distinguished by their learning, occupying positions of influence, and ready to confess Christ, if need were, amid the flames. It is deeply interesting to observe the condition at this day of a city around which the visit of Calvin has thrown so great an interest, and whose church, founded by his hands, held no inconspicuous place among the Protestant churches of France in the early days of the Reformation. Poitiers, we dare say, like the city of Aosta in Italy, is in no wise proud of this episode in its history, and would rather efface than perpetuate the traces of its illustrious visitor, and, indeed, it has been very successful in doing so. We question whether there be now a dozen persons in all Poitiers who know that the great chief of the Reformation once honored it by his residence, and that there he laid the foundations of a Protestant church, which afterwards gave martyrs to the gospel. Poitiers is at this day most unexceptionably Roman Catholic city, and exhibits all the usual proofs and concomitants of genuine Roman Catholicism in the dreariness and stagnation of its streets, and the vacuity and ignorance to be read so plainly on the faces of its inhabitants. The landscape around is doubtless the same as when Calvin went in and out at the gates. There is the same clear, dry, balmy sky. There is the same winding and picturesque ravine, with the rivulet watering its bottom, and its sides here terraced with vines, there overhung with limestone rocks, while cottages perched amid fruit trees and mills, their wheels turned by the stream, are to be seen along its course. East and west of the town lie outspread those plains on which the Black Prince, in the 14th century, marshaled his bowmen, and where French and English blood flowed in commingled torrents, and where 200 years later Calvin restored to its original simplicity that rite which commemorates an infinitely greater victory than hero ever achieved on earth. Within its old limits, unchanged since the times of Calvin, is the town itself. Here has Poitiers been sitting all this long while, nursing its orthodoxy till little besides is left to nurse. Manufactures and commerce have left it. It has but a scanty portion of the corn and wine which the plains around yield to others. Its churches and edifices have grown hoary and tottering. The very chimes of its bells have a weird and drowsy sound, and its citizens, silent, listless, and pensive, look as if they belonged to the 15th century and had no right to be seen moving about in the 19th. In the center of Poitiers is a large quadrangular piazza, a fountain in the middle of it, a clock tower in one of its angles, and numerous narrow lanes running out from it in all directions. These lanes are steep, winding, and ill-paved. In one of these lanes, but a little way from the central piazza, is a venerable pile of Gothic architecture, as old at least as the days of Calvin, and which may have served as the college amongst whose professors and students he found his first disciples. Its gables, turned to the street, show to the passer-by its rich oriels, and pleasant to the eye is its garden of modest dimensions, with its bit of velvet sward, and its trees, old and gnarled, but with life enough in their roots to send along their boughs in spring a rush of rich, massy foliage. A little farther off from the piazza, in another lane which attains the width of a street, and with an open space before it, stands the cathedral, by much the most noticeable of all the buildings of Poitiers. In front is a vast unrolled scroll of history, perhaps we ought to say a biography. It is covered from top to bottom with sculptures, the subjects extremely miscellaneous, and some of them not a little grotesque. The lives of numerous scripture heroes, patriarchs, warriors, and kings are here depicted, being chiseled in stone, while in alternate rows come the effigies of saints and popes and great abbots, and obtruding uncouthly among these venerable and dignified personages are monsters of a form and genus wholly unknown to the geologist. A rare sight must this convention of antediluvians, of medieval popes, and animals whose era it is impossible to fix, have presented when in the prime of its stony existence. But the whole goodly assemblage, under the influence of the weather, is slowly passing into oblivion, and will by and by disappear, leaving only the bare weather-torn sandstone, unless the chisel come timely to the rescue and give the worthies that figure here a new lease on life. Calvin must sometime have crossed the threshold of this cathedral and stood under this roof. The interior is plain indeed, offering a striking contrast to the gorgeous grotesqueness of the exterior. The walls, covered with simple whitewash, are garnished with a few poor pictures, such as a few pence would buy at a print seller's. The usual nave and aisle are wanting, and a row of stone pillars, also covered with whitewash, runs along the center of the floor and supports the roof of the edifice. It had been well if Poitiers had continued steadfast in the doctrine taught it by the man who entered its gates in the March of 1534. Its air at this hour would not have been so thick, nor its streets so stagnant, nor its edifices so crumbling. In short, it would not have been lying stranded now, dropped far astern in the world's onward march. Chapter 14. Catherine de' Medici. St. Paul, Calvin, desire to labor in Paris, driven from this field. Francis I intrigues to outmaneuver Charles V, offers the hand of his second son to the Pope's niece. Joy of Clement VII, the marriage agreed upon. Catherine de' Medici, rise of the house of Medici. Cosmo I, his patronage of letters and scholars. Fiesole Soleil, descendants of Cosmo. Clement VII, birth of Catherine de' Medici. Exposed to danger, lives to mount the throne of France. Catherine as a girl, her fanaticism, her tastes, her morals, her love of power, etc. St. Paul, when converted, fondly hoped to abide at Jerusalem, and from this renowned metropolis, where the kings of Judah had reigned, where the prophets of Yahuwah and one greater than all prophets had spoken, he purposed to spread abroad the light among his countrymen. But a new dispensation had commenced, and there must be found for it a new center. In Judea, Paul would have had only the synagogue for his audience, and his echoes would have died away on the narrow shore of Palestine. He must speak where his voice would sound throughout the world. He must carry the gospel of his master through a sphere as wide as that which the Greek philosophy had occupied, and subjugate, by the power of the cross, tribes as remote as those Rome had vanquished by the force of her arms. And so, too, was it with one who had been styled the second Paul of the Christian dispensation. The plan which Calvin had formed to himself of his life's labors after his conversion had Paris and France as its center. Nearest his heart, and occupying the foreground in all his visions of the future, was his native land. It needed but the gospel to make France the first of the nations, and its throne the mightiest in Europe. And the footing the gospel had already obtained in that land seemed to warrant these great expectations. Had not the gospel found martyrs in France? Was not this a pledge that it would yet triumph on the soil which their blood had watered? Had not the palace opened its gates to welcome it? More wonderful still, it was forcing its way, despite the prejudice and pride of ages, into the halls of the Sorbonne. The many men of letters which France now contained were, with scarce an exception, favorable to the Reformation. The monarch, it is true, had not yet decided, but Margaret, so sweet in disposition, so sincere in her Protestant faith, would not be wanting in her influence with her brother, and thus there was ground to hope that when Francis did decide, his choice would be given in behalf of Protestantism. So stood the matter then. Was it wonderful that Calvin should so linger around Paris and believe that he saw in it the field of his future labors? But ever and anon, as he came back to it, and grasping the seed basket, and begun again to sow, the sky would darken, the winds would begin to howl, and he was forced to flee before a new outburst of the tempest. At last he began to understand that it was not the great kingdom of France, with its chivalrous monarch and its powerful armies, that God had chosen to sustain the battle of the Reformation. A handful only of the French people did the Reformation call to follow it, whose destined work was to glorify it on their own soil by the heroism of the stake, and to help to sow it in others by the privations and sacrifices of exile. But before speaking of Calvin's third and last flight from Paris, let us turn to an incident with the gravest consequences to France and Christendom. The Pope, Spain, and France, the three visible great powers of the age, were by turns the allies and the adversaries of one another. The King of France, who was constantly scheming to recover by the arts of diplomacy those fair Italian provinces which it had lost upon the battlefield, was now plotting against Charles of Spain. The emperor, on his way to Augsburg, was at this moment closeted, as we have already related, with the Pope at Bologna. Francis, who was not ignorant of these things, would frequently ask himself, who can tell what evil may be brewing against France? I shall outmaneuver the crafty Charles. I shall detach the Pope from the side of Spain, and secure him forever to France. For in those days the pontiff, as a dynastic power, counted for more than he afterwards did. Francis thought that he had hit upon a capital device for dealing a blow to his rival. What was it? The Pope, Clement VII, of the house of Medici, had a niece, a little fairy girl of 14. He would propose marriage between this girl and his second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans. The Pope, he did not doubt, would grasp at the brilliant offer, for Clement, he knew, was set on the aggrandizement of his family, and this marriage would place it among the royal houses of Europe. But was Francis I in earnest? Would the King of France stoop to marry his son to the descendant of a merchant? Yes, Francis would digest the mortification which this match might cause him for the sake of the solid advantages, as he believed them to be, which it would bring with it. He would turn the flank of Charles and take his revenge for Pavia. Had Francis feared the God of hosts as much as he did the emperor, and been willing to stoop as low for the gospel as for the favor of the Pope, happy would it have been, both for him and his kingdom. Clement, when the offer was made to him, could scarce believe it. He was in doubt this moment. He was in ecstasy the next. The emperor soon discovered the affair, and foreseeing its consequences to himself, endeavored to persuade the Pope that the King of France was insincere, and counseled him to beware of the snake in the grass. The ambassadors of the French king, the Duke of Albany, and the Cardinals Tournon and Gramont, protested that their master was in earnest, and pushed on the business till at last they had finished it. It was concluded that this girl, Catherine de Medici by name, should be linked with the throne of France, and that the blood of the Valois and the Medici should henceforth be mixed. The Pope strode through his palace halls, elate with the honor which had so unexpectedly come to his house, and refused to enter the league which the emperor was pressing him to form with him against Francis, and would have nothing to do with calling a council for which Charles was importuning him. And the King of France, on his part, thought that if he had stooped, it had been to make a good bargain. He had stipulated that Catherine should bring with her as her dowry Parma, Florence, Pisa, Leghorn, Modena, Urbino, and Peggio, besides the Duchy of Milan and the Lordship of Genoa. This would leave little unrecovered of what had been lost on the field of Pavia. The Pope promised all without the least hesitation. To Clement it was all the same, much or little, for he had not the slightest intention of fulfilling aught of all that he had undertaken. Let us visit the birthplace of this woman, the natal lair of this tigress. Her cradle was placed in one of the most delicious of the Italian vales. Over that vale hung the balmiest of skies, and around it rose the loveliest of mountains, conspicuous among which is the classic Fiesole. The Arno, meandering through it in broad pellucid stream, waters it, and the olive and cypress clothe its bosom with voluptuous luxuriance. In this vale is the city of Florence, and here in the 15th century lived Cosmo the merchant. Cosmo was the founder of that house from which sprung the little bright-eyed girl who bore the name of Catherine de Medici, a name then innocent and sweet as any other, but destined to gather a most unenviable notoriety around it, till it has become one of the most terrific in history, the mention of which evokes only images of tragedy and horrors. With regard to her famous ancestor Cosmo, he was a merchant, we have said, and his ships visited the shores of Greece, the harbors of Egypt, and the towns of the sea-coast of Syria. It was the morning of the Renaissance, and this Florentine merchant had caught its spirit. He gave instructions to his sailing masters, when they touched at the ports of the Levant and Egypt, to make diligent inquiry after any ancient manuscripts that might still survive, whether of the ancient pagan literature or of the early Christian theology. His wishes were carefully attended to, and when his ships returned to Pisa, the port of Tuscany, they were laden with a double freight, the produce and fabrics of the countries they had visited, and the works of the learned men which had slumbered for ages in the monasteries of Mount Athos, the convents of Lebanon, and in the cities and the tombs of the Nile. Thus it was that Cosmo prosecuted, with equal diligence and success, commerce and letters. By the first he laid the foundation of that princely house that long reigned over the Florentine Republic, and by the second he contributed powerfully to the recovery of the Greek and Hebrew languages, as they in their turn contributed to the outbreak of evangelical light, which so gloriously distinguished the century that followed that in which Cosmo flourished. The sacred language is restored, and the book of heaven again opened. The pale, chilly dawn of the Renaissance warmed and brightened into the day of Christianity. Another event contributed to this unhappy turn of affairs. Constantinople had just fallen, and the scholars of the metropolis of the East, fleeing from the arms of the Turk and carrying with them their literary treasures, came to Italy, where they were warmly welcomed by Cosmo and entertained with princely hospitality in his villa on Fiesole. Soleil. The remains of that villa are still to be seen halfway between the base of the hill and the Franciscan monastery that crowns its summit, looking down on the unrivaled dome of Brunelleschi, which even in Cosmo's day adorned the beautiful city of Florence. The terrace is still pointed out, bordered by stately cypresses, where Cosmo daily walked, conversing with the illustrious exiles whom the triumph of the barbarian arms had chased from their native East. The delicious vale of the Arno spread out at their feet, with the clustering towers of the city and the bounding hills in the nearer view, while the remoter mountains, rising peak on peak in the azure distance, lent grandeur to the scene. In gardens, says Hallam, which Tully might have envied, with Ficino, Landino, and Palatine at his side, he delighted his hours of leisure with the beautiful visions of the Platonic philosophy, for which the summer stillness of an Italian sky appears the most congenial accompaniment. His talents, his probity, and his great wealth placed Cosmo at the head of Florence, and gave him the government of the Duchy of Tuscany. His grandson, Lorenzo, better known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, succeeded him in his vast fortune, his literary and aesthetic tastes, and his government of the duchy. Under Lorenzo, the Medici family may be said to have fully blossomed. Lorenzo had 3 sons, Giuliano, Pietro, and Giovanni. The last, John, became pope under the title of Leo X. He inherited his father's taste for magnificence and the Tuscans' love of pleasure. Under him the Vatican became the gayest court in all Christendom, and Rome a scene of revelry and delights not surpassed, if equaled, by any of the capitals of Europe. Leo's career had already come before us. He was far from seeing the day of Peter, but he lived to see Luther's day, and went to the tomb as the morning light of the Reformation was breaking over the world, closing with his last breath the halcyon era of the papacy. He was succeeded in the chair of St. Peter after the short pontificate of Adrian of Utrecht by another of the same family of Medici, Giulio, a nephew of Leo X, who ascended the papal throne under the title of Clement VIII. When Clement took possession of the papal chair, he found a storm gathering around it. To whatever quarter of the sky his eye was turned, there he saw lowering clouds portending furious tempests in the future. Luther was thundering in Germany. The Turk was marshalling his hordes and unfurling his standards on the borders of Christendom. Nearer home, at his gates almost, Francis and Charles were settling with the sword the question of which the two should be master of that fair land, which both meanwhile were laying waste. The infuriated Germans, now scarcely amenable to discipline, were hanging like tempests on the brow of the Alp, and threatening to descend on Rome and make a spoil of all the wealth and art with which the lavish pontificate of Leo X had enriched and beautified it. To complete the unhappiness of the time, the plague had broken out at Rome, and with pomp, festivities, and wassail, which went on all the same, were mingled corpses, funerals, and other gloomy insignia of the tomb. The disorders of Christendom had come to a head, and all men demanded a remedy, but no remedy was found, and mainly for this reason, that no one understood that a cure to be effectual must begin with oneself. Men thought of reforming the world, but leaving the men that composed it as they were. The new pope saw very plainly that the air was thick and the sky lowering, but having vast confidence in his own consummate craft and knowledge of business, he set about the task of replacing the world upon its foundations. This onerous work resolved itself into 4 divisions. First, he had the abusers of his court and capital to correct. Secondly, he had the poise to maintain between Spain and France, taking care that neither power became too strong for him. Thirdly, he had the Turk to drive out of Christendom. And fourthly, and mainly, he had the Reformation to extinguish. And this last gave him more concern than all the rest. His attention to business was unwearied, but labor as he might, it would not all do. The mischiefs of the age could not be cured in a day, even granting that Clement had known how to cure them. But the storm did not come just yet, and Clement continued to toil and intrigue, to threaten the Turk, cajole the kings, and to anathematize Lutheranism, to no other effect than to have the advantage gained by the little triumph of today swept away by the terrible disaster of tomorrow. That woman who was just stepping upon a scene where she was destined long and conspicuously to figure, and where she was to leave as her memorials a throne dishonored and a nation demoralized, here demands a brief notice. Catherine was the daughter of Lorenzo II, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who, as we have said, was the grandson of Cosmo el Vecchio, as he is styled at Florence, founder of the greatness of the Medici family, and so honorably remembered as patron of letters and friend of scholars. Her mother was Magdalene de Bologna, of the royal house of France. Her father survived her birth, 1519, only by a few days. Her mother died while she was still a child, and thus the girl, left an orphan, was taken under the care of her relative, Clement VII. An astrologer was said to have foretold at her birth that the child would be the ruin of her house, and the prediction, as may well be believed, wrought her no good. She was but little cared for, or rather, she was put, on purpose, in the way of receiving harm. She is said to have been placed in a basket and hung outside the wall of a castle that was being besieged, in the hope that a chance arrow might rid them of her, and along with her the calamity which her continued existence was believed to portend. The missiles struck right and left, leaving their indentations on the wall, but the basket was not hit, and the child it enclosed lived on to occupy at a future day the throne of France. When she comes before us, in connection with this marriage scheme, Catherine de' Medici was a girl of 14, of diminutive stature, of sylph-like form, with a fiery light streaming from her eyes. Bright, voluble, and passionate, she bounded from sport to sport, filling the halls where she played with the chatter of her talk and the peals of her merriment. There was about her the power of a strange fascination, which all felt who came near her, but the higher faculties which she displayed in later life had not yet been developed. These needed a wider stage and a loftier position for their display. As she grew up, it was seen that she possessed not a few of the good as well as the evil qualities of the race from which she was sprung. She had a princely heart and a large understanding. To say that she was crafty, astute, and greedy of power, and prudent, patient, and plodding in her efforts to grasp it, is simply to say that she was a Medici. She possessed in no small degree the literary and aesthetic tastes of her illustrious ancestor, Cosmo. She loved splendor as did her great-grandfather, Lorenzo the Magnificent. She was as prodigal and lavish in her habits as Leo X, and withal as great a lover of pleasure. She loved to fill the Louvre with scandals, just as Leo had done the Vatican, and from the court diffused a taint throughout the city, with which Paris was befouled for many a day. The penetration and business habits of her uncle, we style him so, but his birth being suspicious, it is impossible to divine his exact relationship. Clement VII, she inherited, and the pleasure in which she so freely indulged do not appear to have dulled the one or interrupted the other. Above all, she was noted for the truly Medicean feature of an inordinate love of power. Whoever occupied the throne, Catherine was the real ruler of France. Most of the occurrences which made the reigns of her husband and son so tragic, and blackened so dismally that era of history, had their birth in her scheming brain. Not that she loved blood for its own sake, as did some of the Roman emperors, but her will must be done, and whatever cause or person stood in her way must take the consequences by the dungeon or the stake, by the poniard or the poisoned cup. Chapter 15. Marriage of Henry of France to Catherine de' Medici. The Pope sets sail, coasts along to France, meets Francis I at Marseilles, the second son of the King of France married to Catherine de' Medici, her promised dowry, the marriage festivities. Harbingers, Clement's return voyage, his reflections, his dream of a new era, his dream to be read backwards, his troubles, his death. Catherine enters France as Calvin is driven out. Retrogression of Protestantism. Death of Catherine de' Medici. Death's 5 visits to the palace. Each visit assists Catherine in her ascent to power. Her crimes. She gains no real success. The marriage is to take place, and accordingly the Pope embarks at Leghorn and sets out for the port of Marseilles, where he is to meet the King of France and conclude the transaction. Popes have never loved ships, unless it were the bark of St. Peter, nor cared to sail in any sea save the sea ecclesiastic. But Clement's anxiety about the marriage overcame his revulsion to the waves. He sails along the coast of Italy. He passes the Gulf of Spezia. He rounds the bold headland of Montefino. Genoa is passed, and now the shore of Nice, where the ridge of the Apennine divides Italy from France. It's under his lee, and thus, wafted along these classic waters by soft breezes, he enters, in the beginning of October 1533, the harbor of Marseilles. Catherine did not accompany him. She tarried at Nice, meanwhile, to be at hand when she should be wanted. The interview between the pontiff and the king terminated to the satisfaction of both parties. Francis again stipulated that the bride should bring as outfit 3 rings, the Duchess of Urbino, Milan, and Genoa, and Clement had no difficulty in promising everything, seeing he meant to perform nothing. All being arranged, the little Tuscan beauty was now sent for, and amid the benedictions of the Pope, the congratulations of the courtiers, the firing of cannon, ringing of bells, and rejoicings of the populace, Catherine de' Medici, all radiant with joy and sparkling with jewels, became the daughter-in-law of Francis I and wife of the Duke of Orleans, the future Henry II. In the banquet chamber, in which sat Catherine de' Medici as the bride of the future Henry II of France, well might there have been set a seat for the skeleton which the Egyptians in ancient times were wont to introduce into their festal halls. Had that guest sat amid the courtiers at Marseilles, glaring on them with empty sockets, and mingling his ghastly grin with their gay merriment, all must have confessed that never had his presence been more fitting, nor his portent more truly prophetic. Or if this was not clearly seen at the moment, how plain did it become in later years, when the bridal torches were exchanged for martyr fires, and the marriage songs were turned into wailings, which ever and anon rang through France, and each time with the emphasis of a deeper woe. But before that day should fully come, Clement was to sleep in marble. Francis, too, was to be borne to the royal vaults of St. Denis, leaving, as the curse of his house and kingdom, the once lively, laughing little girl, whose arrival he signalized with these vast rejoicings, and who was yet too young to take much interest in court intrigue, or to feel that thirst for power which was to awaken in her breast with such terrible strength in years to come. The marriage festivities were at an end, and Pope Clement VII turned his face toward his own land. He had come as far as to see the utmost borders of the children of the Reformation, and like another Balaam, he had essayed to curse them, and he had come doubly armed. He grasped Catherine in the one hand, he held a bull of anathema in the other. The first he engrafted on France, the second he hurled against the Lutherans, and having shot this bolt, he betook him again to his galleys. A second time the winds were propitious. As he sailed along over the blue sea, he could indulge his reveries undistracted by those influences to which popes, like other men, are liable on shipboard. He had taken a new pledge of France that it should not play the part England was now playing. France was now more than ever the eldest daughter of the papacy. Clement, moreover, had fortified himself on the side of Spain. To the greatness of that power he himself, above most men, had contributed when he acted as the secretary and adviser of his uncle Leo X. But its sovereigns becoming less the champions and more the masters of the papacy, Spain caused the Pope considerable uneasiness. Now, however, it was less likely that the emperor would press for a council, the very idea of which was so terrible to the Pope. He could scarce eat by day or sleep by night, and so, as the coast of France sank behind him and the headlands of Italy rose on his brow, he thought of the new splendor with which he had invested his house and name, and the happier days he was now likely to see in the Vatican. Nevertheless, the horizon did not clear up. The storm still lowered above Rome. The last year of Clement's life, for he was now drawing toward the grave, was the unhappiest he had yet seen. Not one of all his fond anticipations was there that did not misgive him. If the dreams of ordinary mortals are to be read backwards, much more, as Clement and even pontiffs in our own time have experienced, are the dreams of popes. The emperor became more pressing for a council than ever. The Protestants of Germany, having formed a powerful league, had now a voice at the political council table of Christendom. Nay, with his own hands Clement had been rearing a rampart around them, inasmuch as his alliance with Francis made Charles draw toward Protestants, whose friendship was now more necessary to him. Even the French king, now his ally, could not be depended upon. Catherine's 3 rings the Pope had not made forthcoming, and Francis threatened, if they were not speedily sent, to come and fetch them, to fill up Clement's cup, already bitter enough, and brimming over, as one would think. His 2 nephews quarreled about the sovereignty of Florence, and were fighting savagely with one another. To whatever quarter Clement turned, he saw only present trouble and portents of worse to come. It was hard to say whether he had most to dread from his enemies or from his friends, from the heretical princes of Germany or from the Christian king of France. and the most Catholic king of Spain.